Snow covered the park bench. She was underneath. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks in the storm, but then I saw the faintest twitch, a fragile paw pushing against the cold wood. A German Shepherd puppy, black and tan, curled into herself like she was trying to disappear. Her fur was dusted white with frost, her little chest barely rising. People must have walked past this bench all morning, but nobody stopped. I bent down, brushing the snow away, and for a moment I was frozen too. Her eyes opened just enough to look at me. They weren't begging. They weren't angry. They were simply tired. She had been left to sleep forever under that bench, and the snow had almost succeeded. My name is Declan, and I've seen enough loss to know what giving up looks like. But this pup hadn't let go. Not yet. Her body was stiff when I slid my arms beneath her, light as a shadow. I could feel the bones of a young dog under her fur, so fragile against my chest. I whispered to her, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. "You're not alone anymore." The storm whipped against my face, but all I could think about was keeping her warm. I didn't know why I named her in that instant, but the word came out like a prayer. Lyra. The bench behind me looked the same, a simple piece of wood covered in white. But what I carried away from it was something the snow had tried to erase. A little soul still fighting. A German Shepherd puppy that shouldn't have survived the night, yet here she was, breathing against my jacket. I walked quickly, boots sinking in the drifts, not daring to think about what might happen if I'd been an hour later. Her paw twitched again, a tiny movement, but enough to remind me she was still here. Each breath felt like the strike of a match, fragile but burning. The storm grew heavier as I reached my truck, and the heater took too long to wake up. I wrapped her in an old flannel shirt from the back seat, pressing her close, whispering her new name again and again, Lyra. She stirred, a faint sigh, and my throat tightened. The park bench vanished in the mirror, buried deeper in snow, but the image burned into me. A pup no one saw, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the end. And now she was in my hands, against all odds, with the night still ahead. She gave the faintest sound, not a bark, not even a whimper, just a breath that told me she hadn't surrendered. And in that sound was the promise that her story was only beginning. Her body was cold against me, far too cold, and I could feel every shiver rattle through her fragile frame, as if she was nothing but bones and fur wrapped in silence. I cranked the heater as high as it would go, pulled her closer to my chest, and pressed my cheek to her head, willing her to feel something warmer than the storm we had left behind. She didn't move much, only a twitch in her paw, a flicker of life that felt both too small and too enormous at once. The road back to my cabin twisted through the trees, the snow falling so hard it blurred the headlights into pale tunnels. I kept glancing down at her, terrified that the stillness meant she was slipping away. I whispered her name again and again. Lyra, stay with me. You're safe now. It wasn't just for her. It was for me too. Each time I said it, I was fighting back the fear of arriving home with only silence in my arms. By the time I carried her inside, my boots had left a trail of water across the wood floor, but none of it mattered. I set her gently onto an old wool blanket by the fire, layered another one on top, and rubbed her sides to get the blood moving. She was too weak to lift her head, too tired even to resist my touch. Her eyes barely opened, then closed again, but I felt the slow rhythm of her breathing deepen just enough to tell me she was still here. I remembered when my sister's dog used to curl beside the same fireplace, back before the world felt so empty. I'd sworn I'd never let myself love another pup, not after watching the heartbreak that followed. But staring at this small creature, shaking and silent yet still clinging to life, I felt something breaking loose inside me, something I thought I'd buried with the past. I spooned warm water into a bowl and dabbed her mouth with a cloth, hoping a drop or two would slip inside. A flicker of her tongue proved she hadn't given up. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Such a tiny effort, but it meant the world. She was answering me in the only way she could, and I wasn't going to stop trying. The fire crackled louder, filling the room with a glow that painted her fur in gold and shadow. I tucked the blanket tighter around her, refusing to look away, afraid she might vanish if I blinked. The night was long, the storm was far from over, but for the first time since I found her, I let myself believe she might actually see the morning. Her fragile body shifted ever so slightly, And in that movement was the promise of another breath, another chance, and the faintest spark of hope that her story wasn't finished yet. The storm beat against the windows through the night, but inside the cabin it was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the faint sound of her breathing. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every rise and fall of her small chest felt like a battle she might not win, and I found myself counting each one, terrified the next wouldn't come. I sat on the floor beside her, my hand resting gently over the blanket, feeling the faint pulse of life beneath. Hours passed, and though her eyes stayed closed, she shifted closer to the heat. That tiny movement broke something open in me. She wasn't just surviving, she was choosing to fight. I whispered to her, promising that she'd never face the cold alone again. I didn't know if she understood my words, but I felt her little body press against my hand as if to answer. By dawn, the fire was low and my eyes burned, but I saw her ear twitch. Then slowly she lifted her head, weak, trembling, but undeniable. My throat closed as I watched her look around the room, confused as if she couldn't quite believe she was still alive. For a heartbeat, her gaze met mine, and I saw more than exhaustion. I saw defiance. I brought her a shallow bowl of water, holding it near her mouth. At first, nothing happened. Then her tongue flicked once, then again, and she drank. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. That sound, the quiet lapping, was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in years. She wasn't just holding on anymore, she was coming back. I found some soft food and mashed it into paste, letting her lick a little from my finger. It took time, but she swallowed, and I felt tears sting my eyes. A rescued puppy doesn't always trust right away, but she leaned toward me, fragile and unsteady, as if she was placing her survival in my hands. That kind of trust humbles a man. When she finished, she rested her head against my wrist and sighed. The first true sound of comfort since I'd found her. I stroked her fur gently, realizing that in saving her I might be saving something in myself I thought was gone. The storm outside finally began to quiet, but inside the cabin, a new storm was rising, hope. She shifted closer, curling against my leg, and in that small act of closeness, I felt the beginning of a bond neither of us had expected. The night had tried to take her, but the morning light revealed something else. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live, and I knew the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. Morning light spilled through the frosted windows, and she stirred again, her head heavy but her eyes a little brighter than before. I stayed close, watching every flicker of movement, half afraid that if I looked away, she'd disappear back into silence. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling, and for a moment my heart leapt, until she collapsed back onto the blanket with a soft thud. I rushed to steady her, whispering her name. Lyra. Even in her weakness, she lifted her gaze toward me, and that look alone was enough to keep me from giving in to fear. I remembered the last time I held a small dog this close, years ago, when my sister's shepherd dog used to curl against my lap during long winters. Losing both of them had carved out a space in me, I thought, would never heal. Watching this stray pup struggle to rise, I felt the same old ache, but also something else, the possibility of letting myself hope again. She was teaching me moment by moment that survival isn't quiet, it's stubborn. I offered her another sip of water, holding the bowl steady. She drank more this time, slow but steady, and when she was done, she rested her muzzle against my wrist as though she belonged there. A rescued puppy doesn't choose to trust lightly, yet she was giving me everything she had left. I sat there, barely breathing, not wanting to break the fragile thread tying us together. I warmed milk and softened bread, trying to coax her into eating again. It took patience, but little by little she accepted it. Each bite was a victory. Each swallow was proof she hadn't surrendered to the night under that bench. I whispered encouragement like I was talking to a child learning to walk, my voice cracking at times. She flicked her ears as though she was listening, and I could almost believe she understood. When she grew too tired, she curled into the crook of my arm, her fur damp with melted snow but radiating a faint warmth now. I held her as if she was the only living thing that mattered, because in that moment she was. The storm had passed outside, but inside me it was only beginning. As I watched the firelight flicker across her small body, I realized how much of myself I'd already given to her in less than a day. And When she let out a tiny sigh, sinking into sleep against me, I knew this was more than chance. She was a lost pup with a fragile heartbeat, but she was also a mirror I hadn't expected to face again. Her breath steadied, her body pressed closer, and in that quiet moment, I felt the fragile beginning of trust taking root between us. But trust is fragile, and I knew the hardest test was still waiting. By the second morning, she was still weak, but the silence of the cabin was no longer heavy. When I opened my eyes, I found her not on the blanket where I had left her, but nestled against my leg on the floor. At some point in the night, the little pup had dragged herself closer, pressing into me as though she knew safety lived in my shadow. That single choice unraveled me. A rescued puppy doesn't crawl toward a man unless something inside her believes again. Her eyes were clearer now, still rimmed with exhaustion but carrying a spark that hadn't been there before. When I reached out, she leaned into my hand, and that small gesture shattered whatever distance I had tried to keep. I whispered her name, Lyra, and she lifted her ears for the first time. It felt like she was introducing herself back to the world, one fragile moment at a time. I warmed her food again, kneeling on the wooden floor as she licked it from my fingers. Each bite seemed to give her a little more strength. By the time she finished, she managed to stand on shaky legs, her paws spread wide for balance. It wasn't graceful, but it was more than survival. It was defiance. She swayed, fell once, but got up again, and I clapped softly, telling her she was brave. The sound of my own laughter startled me. I hadn't heard it in years, and it felt strange coming from my chest. Watching this small dog fight to rise stirred something I thought was gone. She wasn't just an abandoned puppy I found under snow. She was a reminder of what resilience looked like. When she finally collapsed back into my lap, panting with the effort, I stroked her fur and let her rest. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I was feeling. This little companion had no idea she was stitching back pieces of me with every breath she took. I had carried her away from death, but she was the one carrying me back toward life. The fire hummed behind us, the storm now only a whisper outside, and Lyra shifted her head onto my knee with a sigh that sounded like belonging. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile thread between us. She had survived another night, chosen another morning, and for the first time I felt that her will to live was stronger than the shadows chasing her. Her body was still frail, her steps uncertain, but in her eyes burned the faintest flicker of trust. And I knew trust was a seed that would either grow or be tested. The days that followed were quiet, but they carried the rhythm of change. Each morning, Lyra woke a little stronger, her fragile body gaining steadiness one paw at a time. She followed me from room to room, her small shadow trailing behind as though afraid I might vanish if she let me out of sight. A rescued puppy often clings like that, carrying the memory of being left behind. I didn't mind. Every step she took toward me felt like a vow that trust was possible again. The first time she barked, it startled us both. A rough, broken sound that came from deep in her chest, almost a question more than a bark. I laughed, kneeling to hold her face between my hands. "That's your voice," I told her. She wagged her tail for the first time then, a weak but undeniable thump against the floor, and the sound filled the cabin with a warmth the fire alone could never give. In the evenings, I sat by the hearth while Lyra rested with her head on my boot. Sometimes she would twitch in her sleep, little paws running through whatever dream she carried. I'd reach down, steadying her, whispering she was safe. Stray pups don't let go of fear overnight. It lingers, shadowing every movement. But each time she pressed closer to me, I knew she was learning to rewrite the story of her nights. I started calling her my brave pup when she managed short walks outside. She moved slowly, still cautious, but she stopped trembling at the sound of the wind. She sniffed the air, lifted her head, and I watched the life return to her piece by piece. A young dog like her shouldn't have known such cold and hunger, but resilience burned in her like an ember that refused to die. One afternoon, I set a small bowl of food in front of her, expecting hesitation. Instead, she looked at me once and then ate eagerly, her tail wagging with every bite. It wasn't just nourishment, it was acceptance, a signal that she trusted what I offered. A loyal puppy knows when it's home, and in that moment I realized the cabin had stopped feeling like a shelter for one and started to feel like a place for two. By the end of that week, I no longer wondered if she'd survive. I wondered what she might become. Because every rescued puppy carries more than scars. They carry the promise of who they're meant to be. Lyra wasn't just surviving the snow anymore. She was learning how to belong, and that belonging was about to be tested in a way neither of us expected. By the end of the second week, the little pup was no longer the fragile shadow I had carried from the snow. Lyra had begun to move through the cabin with a new rhythm, her paws clicking softly across the floorboards, her tail wagging whenever she caught my eye. What had once been a silent house now pulsed with life. A rescued puppy has a way of filling space you didn't realize was empty, and Lyra was doing just that. She had started to play. At first, it was small things, nudging my glove across the rug, tilting her head at the sound of the kettle. But soon she discovered my boots, dragging one halfway across the room with a determination far bigger than her frame. Watching her stumble and tug made me laugh out loud, a sound I hadn't recognized in my own voice for years. A playful puppy doesn't need much, just something to carry, something to chew, and someone to watch her proudly. The first time she bounded clumsily after a ball of crumpled paper, she tumbled head over tail and landed in a heap, but she scrambled up, ears pricked, eyes bright. I clapped, and she barked in reply, her voice stronger now, no longer the broken sound from those first days. It was as if she was reclaiming what had been stolen in the cold. A voice, a spirit, a place in the world. Every evening she curled against me by the fire, a loyal puppy whose body finally radiated warmth instead of trembling. She had learned to trust my hand, to close her eyes without fear, to dream without waking in panic. But trust is delicate, and the world outside the cabin still carried echoes of the night she had been abandoned. I could see it sometimes in the way she startled at sudden noises, or how she pressed close whenever strangers passed the window. A rescued pup doesn't forget overnight. It carries memory in its bones. That was when the call came. The local shelter had been overwhelmed by strays after the storm, and they needed extra help. I hadn't stepped foot in that building in years. But now, with Lyra curled at my feet, I felt something stir. I told her we'd go, that she'd come with me, and though she didn't understand my words, her tail thumped as if she already knew. The next morning, I clipped a small yellow collar around her neck, the first collar she had ever worn. She shook her head, pawed at it, then trotted to the door as if ready for the journey. I opened it, snow crunching under our boots and paws, and for the first time I felt like she wasn't just surviving my world. She was walking into her own. And I didn't know yet that the place we were heading to would uncover the scars she still carried and test the fragile bond we'd built. The shelter was alive with noise the moment we walked through the doors. Dogs barking, claws scratching against metal, the air thick with sense of fear and hope tangled together. Lyra froze beside me, her ears back, her body pressed close to my leg. A rescued puppy that had once known nothing but silence now stood in a storm of sound, and I could feel her fear like it was my own. I crouched down, letting her lean against me, whispering her name. She trembled, her small frame vibrating with a memory I couldn't erase. This was the kind of place she might have been left before, a place where the lonely waited behind bars. A stray pup doesn't forget what needs to be unwanted. I rubbed her chest slowly, grounding her, reminding her that this time was different. She wasn't a forgotten dog anymore. She had me. When another young puppy barked from a nearby kennel, Lyra startled and tried to pull away, backing toward the door. My heart broke seeing her eyes widen, but I knew I couldn't just carry her out. She had to learn that not every cage meant abandonment. Not every noise was danger. I held the leash gently, not forcing her forward, waiting until she took one cautious step on her own. That one step changed everything. Her tail didn't wag, not yet, but she walked beside me as we passed the rows of kennels. Dogs pressed their noses to the bars, tails whipping, desperate for touch. Lyra lowered her head, unsure, but her eyes stayed fixed on me. A brave pup doesn't always charge ahead, it simply refuses to stop moving. In the play yard, away from the noise, I unclipped her collar. At first, she stood frozen, then another small dog bounded over, dropping a chewed rope at her paws. Lyra looked at it, then at me, and for a heartbeat I thought she would retreat. Instead, she bent her head, nudged the rope, and the two of them began a clumsy, hesitant tug. Her tail lifted, a shaky wag at first, then stronger. Watching her discover that other dogs weren't threats but companions was like watching dawn break after too long a night. She was finding her place among them, one careful step at a time. But when the wind gusted across the yard, rattling the chain-link fence, she bolted into the corner, curling tight against the ground. The rope dropped from her mouth, forgotten. She was no longer a playful puppy in that moment. She was back under the bench, buried in snow, waiting for it all to end. I hurried to her side, heart pounding, realizing the past hadn't loosened its grip as much as I wanted to believe, and as she shook against me, I knew the shadows we'd escaped still had more to say. I gathered her into my arms in the corner of that yard, her small body trembling so hard I could feel it echo through my chest. A rescued puppy doesn't always know the difference between past and present. Sometimes fear blurs the lines. I whispered her name again and again, smoothing her fur, and slowly her breathing steadied, though her eyes stayed wide. I knew then that trust alone wouldn't erase what had been done to her. Later that evening, one of the volunteers called me into the office. They had found something, a piece of footage from a nearby park camera, days old, showing a figure leaving a box near the bench. And inside that box, just before the snow buried it, was her. My stomach tightened as I watched the blurry clip. Whoever it was never looked back. The sight of it filled me with anger I didn't want, but the little pup asleep at my feet reminded me that anger wasn't what she needed. What she needed was someone to see her worth. I looked down at her curled on the blanket, chest rising and falling in the soft rhythm of sleep. A stray pup discarded like trash, yet here she was, breathing, surviving, choosing to live. It struck me how much strength can hide in something so small. She wasn't broken, she was scarred, and scars are proof of survival. The next day I brought her back to the shelter yard. She hesitated at the gate, her tail low, ears flat. But when a child visiting the shelter knelt nearby, holding out a timid hand, Lyra lifted her head. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, with a slow step, she pressed her nose against that small hand. The boy smiled, and Lyra's tail gave the faintest wag. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd hoped. Watching her lean into that child's touch, I realized she wasn't just healing, she was beginning to heal others. A brave pup can carry more than its own story. I guess it can light a path for someone else who is afraid. The boy had been hesitant to touch any dog before, but Lyra's gentleness cracked through his fear. When she returned to me, curling into my lap as if to anchor herself, I felt it in my bones. This was more than survival. This was transformation. She was proving, piece by fragile piece, that a lost pup could rise from abandonment into belonging. But belonging comes with its own test. And I knew the moment her strength returned fully, she would face a choice. Cling to the safety of my arms or step into a bigger world waiting for her. The turning point came one gray afternoon when the shelter hosted an adoption fair in the park. Tents lined the grass, colorful leashes stretched in every direction, and families wandered with curious eyes. I had brought Lyra along, not to give her away. My heart couldn't imagine it. But to help her learn that the world outside wasn't only cold benches and snow. She walked beside me with hesitant steps, her little paws brushing the frost-tipped grass, her tail tucked but not hidden. Children knelt to greet the playful puppies around us, and Lyra pressed against my leg, uncertain. A rescued puppy doesn't just leap into joy, it tests the ground first, as if waiting for it to crumble. I knelt too, guiding her closer to the laughter, and slowly she lifted her head. The first time a girl dropped her mitten and Lyra sniffed it, then pushed it gently back with her nose, people noticed. Smiles rippled around us. She didn't know she had just captured their hearts. Soon a small crowd had gathered. Families asked her name, reaching hands toward her with softness. Lyra looked from them back to me, searching my face for permission. I nodded, and she stepped forward, tail twitching in a cautious wag. She allowed herself to be touched, even licked the fingers of a boy who giggled in surprise. In that moment, she wasn't the abandoned puppy anymore. She was a brave pup, choosing connection. And then it happened. A sudden crack from the loudspeaker echoed through the park, sharp and jarring. Lyra bolted, leash jerking tight in my hand, her body diving under the edge of a tent. She curled into a ball, trembling like the night I found her. The crowd's laughter faded into silence. I dropped to the ground, crawling under the canvas, whispering her name over and over. Her eyes were wild, her breath ragged, as if the whole world had turned against her again. I stroked her fur, heart pounding, reminding her that she wasn't alone, that she would never be left again. Slowly, the trembling eased. She lifted her head, pressed her nose to my hand, and in that fragile moment of trust, I knew she had chosen me as much as I had chosen her. When I guided her back into the light, the applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for her, the small dog who had faced fear and stepped back into the world. The fair ended with families taking home wagging tails, new beginnings sparking everywhere. Lyra wasn't adopted that day, not by anyone else. She walked out beside me, no longer a stray pup lost in the snow, but something stronger, something more alive. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, as the world had seen her courage. But the hardest step, the one that would truly change everything, was still waiting ahead. Back at the cabin that night, Lyra curled against me by the fire, her breathing steady, her eyes soft with trust. I thought about how far she had come, from the frozen ground beneath that park bench to this warm space where she no longer trembled alone. A rescued puppy doesn't just survive, it teaches you what survival really means. She had taught me. In the days that followed, something shifted. She greeted mornings with a spark, rushing to the door to meet the world instead of hiding from it. The little pup who once cowered at every sound now barked proudly at birds passing the window, her voice strong and certain. Each wag of her tail felt like a declaration. She belonged. Then came the visit that sealed her future. A family from San Diego had seen her at the fair and asked to meet her again. They drove hours just to sit with her in the shelter yard. Lyra approached them slowly, cautious but curious, and when their daughter crouched low, holding out a tennis ball, Lyra nudged it with her nose. The girl laughed, threw it, and to my surprise, Lyra ran after it, ears flying, paws skidding in the dirt. When she dropped it back at the girl's feet, tail whipping, I knew something powerful had just begun. They returned again the next week. Each time, Lyra grew braver, her eyes brighter, her body leaning less into my shadow and more into their light. She was no longer only my rescued dog. She was becoming their loyal puppy, their little companion, their brave pup who had survived the snow. Watching her press her head into their daughter's arms was both heartbreaking and healing. Love sometimes means letting go. On the day they signed the adoption papers, I knelt in front of her one last time as mine. Her paws pressed against my knees, her eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, the cabin, the snow, the bench, all of it flashed back. I whispered, "You're safe now, Lyra. You're home." She licked my hand, then turned, trotting toward her new family without looking back in fear. As their car pulled away, I stood in the quiet, the leash still warm in my hand. I didn't feel empty. I felt full, like the world had just reminded me that even the smallest dog, even the most abandoned puppy, can rise into love when given the chance. And though she was gone from my arms, I knew her story wasn't ending. It was only beginning, and the life waiting for her was brighter than any fire I could give. Lyra's journey will stay with me forever. From the frozen silence beneath a snow-covered bench to the warmth of a family's embrace, she proved that even the smallest and most fragile can carry the weight of survival. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. She reminded me that caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's responsibility. It's pet care. It's showing up when no one else will. Every abandoned pup, every stray dog, every little companion waiting behind a gate deserves that chance. Lyra found hers, and in her new home, she'll never have to wonder again if she belongs. I tell her story not just for her, but for the countless furry pups still waiting. When you share stories like this, you don't just spread hope, you create it. You help someone stop at the bench, open the box, kneel down in the snow. You help another shepherd pup find their second chance. Join our Brave Paws family. Be their voice. Be their hope.